The All-Age Travellers, a story by Nikos. The Dolfinian had travelled a long way from his own native hometown of Aldolfinia. He had travelled far to the lands of the Eldorians, even though he greatly feared being introverted by the Eldorians, as the great Dolfinian sages had warned him and many others. However, he feared being extroverted by the Adultarians, as he had worked with the Tarians in the past many times. But he mused over the differences and the different risks there were between the Eldorians and the Adultarians themselves. Musing on all this whilst on the long meandering journey, travelling towards that ancient decaying world of the old Eldorians themselves, where the secrets of the ancient wisdom were rumoured to be. But who knew? He'd never travelled, nor certainly lived in Eldoria. Perhaps it was the desire to be introverted by them, or with them, if that even was such a thing. But many had a great fear of the Eldorians' introverting ways. He had worked for the Taurians, of course, a long time ago. The Tarians he knew well from his parents, and going up to work his various father's factory. As many from Dolfinians were migrant workers. The Dolfinians travelled off in the trains and buses, travelling towards the great land of the Doltarians. The Tarians would often hire many Dolfinian workers. That's where he met a few of the other Tarian workers themselves, who were talking about retiring one day. They hoped to go to Eldoria itself one day, when they finally finished the great work itself, though no one knew how long and when that would be. Although not all of the Tarians themselves wanted to retire to Eldoria, some wanted to live forever in Talia, in the great Adultarian lifestyle itself. Some wanted to return and go back to their own life, back to their original home, to the Dolfinian kingdoms, to Adolphia, to return to their passionate dramas that they'd once lived in, to the world where the emotional roller coasters drove one through. Many longed for the incredible joys and that great optimism of their earlier lifestyle, and the fellow Dolfinians, yet they lingered too long in Talian lifestyle, and they knew not what Dolfinian lifestyle was now, only what it was back then when they lived there. Yet others saw it all as nostalgia for a past long gone, and only remembering the good points and not the incredible angers and sorrows and the confusions that had to be subdued also, yet would express itself in all manner of spontaneous actions of love and hate and different emotions, whilst the Tarians themselves were much more controlled and restrained in managing their emotions, much more than the Dolfinians could ever do. Yet the Adolphians, their motto was to always follow your heart, follow your dreams. That had become one of the more recent interpretations of their great religion, the Great Heart as it was known. There was a giant heart that people drove through at the entrance of Adolphia. All Dolfinians had to pass under the giant heart at their exit and their entrance to the Dolfinian world. They were young people who were ruled by emotions more than thoughts themselves, and who also tried to rule over others with their emotions too, as well as submitting to others emotionally also. For better or worse, they ruled and were ruled by their love and their fears. Their love and their fears of themselves, but also of others too. Their preachers sung songs about loving the world, or hating the world sometimes too, or fearing the world, or standing up for the world sometimes also. Or they told stories of a terrifying world of the Tarians themselves. Others told of the Tarians being magical, even heavenly, mystical sometimes. The Tarians were often portrayed in the Dolfinian stories as either monsters, sometimes as great mothers, sometimes demons, and sometimes angels the Tarians would appear as in the stories. Perhaps, and those from the Eldorian lands, were only those that could visit Talia sometimes. They were only visited by some of the Dolfinians, Not all Dolphinians ever went to Thalia, to the land of the Adultalians. Many Dolphinians never went to Eldoria either. Just as only a minority of the Dorians were now visiting the former world, their old former world that they still got to visit sometimes, of Adolphinia, as it was formerly called, where the Dolphinians all lived. It was a very long way, though, to go between such far distant places, and it meant also travelling through the Tarian territories themselves. The land of the angels and demons, as some of the Dolphinians had called it, of course. Though never to a Tarian's face did you ever say that. As for what the Eldorians themselves called Thalia, or Adultalia, as some more formally pronounced it, the travelling Adolphinians really didn't know what the Eldorians thought of Thalia. They really just didn't know and hadn't met enough of them to know the consensus yet. At the main entrance to the giant world of Thalia itself, or Adultalia, as it was pronounced in some regions, or Doltalia in other regions. One was supposed to call it an official name, but it was often called a great many different things besides. When in those great lands, there was a giant computer on the entrance that one passed through, a giant machine. One passed under and into this giant machine, with the motto graven above that was chiselled out in the metal: follow your reasoning, follow logic. The big motto on one of their large doorways, a metallic machine structure that cars drove through endlessly. Here ideology, not emotion, was what was supreme. Science was the religion. Although there were many different competing sciences, of course, and a whole kaleidoscope, a whole variety of different kinds. But those were sociable, and they were more objective. And there were many emerging also, different kinds of sciences that were mixing in different ways. Entering into the Tarian world, it was really like a foreign world of multiple different strains of ideology. Long, widespread ideological arguments and debates everywhere that one knew little to nothing about as a Dolphinian, or even sometimes the Eldorians claimed themselves they knew little about it too. It was like leaving Fantasia, that really within the Tarian lands there was a small area of Fantasia that the Tarians were said to be responsible to look after, have a right to look after. Though whether they were responsible or not, the Dolphinians and the Eldorians themselves debated. When one first gets exiled or escapes the earlier land, the more primitive land of Fantasia itself, and then is exiled and pushed out and escapes finally to the land of the Dolphinians, Dolphinia itself, finally escaping Fantasia, and then discovering the whole spectrum, the world of emotions that one has some awareness of, a little knowledge and experience of, but finally being able to explore those worlds of emotions more fully. Of course, they'd known the fears and desires, the joys and the sorrows, the angers and the contentments even, that they'd found even in earlier Fantasia, in the primitive earlier life themselves. Yet not to the extent of the Dolphinian lifestyle, not in Dolphinian emotions, not to that great depth. They'd known a loving family, sometimes a hurting family in the past. Yet the Dolphinians, they knew or felt a loving world, loving societies, or hurting worlds and hurting societies. If love is the religion of the Dolphinians and truth the religion of the Tarians, then I wonder what kind of religion would the Eldorians have had themselves? Or would they even have one? This was one of the questions that had driven on the Dolphinian visitor, the traveller going towards, hoping to visit Eldoria itself. An old Eldorian sat in one of the train carriages. As the youth from Dolphinia, the Dolphinian youth who saw nothing in interrupting the stranger's book reading. Anyway, he was glancing out the train window, the Dorians staring out at the horizon, far away, almost motionless, as the nearby scenery flashed by. as if thinking over some passage in the book, contemplating it. Or was he just staring out blanklessly, thoughtlessly, staring out at scenery rushing past, or the slowly moving mountains in the background? Impossible to tell from glancing at him, as the older man seemed not to give much away, hadn't glanced back at him, not for a long while, just gave him the briefest of smiles and a little nod, politely, when he'd entered into the carriage, the Dolphinian sitting opposite the Eldorian. Then he soon began reading through his notes, getting out a large book and ruffling through various pages, flipping through ever so slowly, occasionally turning to glance out the window for long stares, alternating between staring out at his words and glancing out at the scenery. "Are you a Dorian?" finally the youth had suddenly asked, choosing to risk a question, interrupting the Eldorian's stare. The elder man glanced swiftly, a little surprised, raising an eyebrow, turning to the youth, the Dolphinian. "No, I'm from Fantasia," the older man said, with a grinning smile, after a slight pause, and the youth laughed a little, forcing one. "I know, everyone's from there. I meant, are you living there now, in Eldoria?" asked the youth, after a time, not sure how to respond at first. "No, I'm living here, with you now, in the in-between worlds," said the Eldorian, after another long pause, as if considering, first studying the youth, as he had done the mountains just earlier out the window. The Dolphinian didn't laugh, though, if it was meant to be a joke. He felt a little annoyed at the elder purposefully misunderstanding, as it seemed to be, almost making a joke on him, like some of the Dolphinians would do. "But you live in Eldoria?" persisted the youth, asking. "Well, I exist in Eldoria, that much is true," began the Dorian, after a time, after another very long pause, and he seemed to be on the cusp of saying something, but then bit his lip, paused, after a very long time of thinking. "I'm not a captive of the Tarians, though, if that's what you're thinking," said the Dorian finally, then seeing a confused face on the Dolphinian, because surely people in Eldoria did more than just exist. He couldn't be serious. "I didn't mean that," began the boy defensively, wishing he hadn't even bothered to befriend or try and ask this strange Dorian character. "I am a resident of Eldoria. Have been for a long time, yes. I left Talia a very long time ago," said the Dorian finally now. "Longer than I care to remember," he said, staring out the window, as if he couldn't bear to look at the Dolphinian any longer. "I do visit friends in the Dolphinian Republic occasionally," stated the Dorian, turning back now to stare at the young man. He stated it formally, as if addressing one of the Tarian questioners in the Inquisition once more, though he loosened up and gave a little smile afterwards to compensate for his formal tone. "You have friends in Dolphinia?" finally asked the youth, uncertain, and regretting saying it, although it was an odd choice of wording. "Yes, a few that visited me. They visited Eldoria itself when I first went there. They helped me to get all the paperwork in order, and—" "Paperwork?" asked the youth, interrupting. "Yes, you must have all your papers in order to enter Eldoria. You haven't got yours in order. You must have them, surely, to get through there," then asked the Dorian, a little confused, his eyebrows raised, a little flummoxed looking. "No one said I needed a passport or any papers to enter Eldoria," said the Dolphinian, now looking confused himself. "I thought it was just the Tarians that needed those," he asked. "Well, it's not exactly a passport. No, it's more of a questioning. There'll be border controls, questioners there. You know, where Talia at the border meets Doria, as they say," said the Dorian himself, as if all that was quite obvious and had been said 100 times before. "What will they ask me?" said the Dolphinian. They ask for a reason. You must always have a reason to enter. You must have a reason composed. It doesn't have to be written on paper, essentially, but it has to be a good, valid reason. The Tarians love their reasoning, don't you know? It's so essential for them. Not that the Eldorians care that much, we don't ourselves, but to leave Teria, the land of reasoning, you must have a good reason to leave Teria itself. And Eldoria is on the border of Teria itself, of course. So technically you'll be entering Teria just briefly at the station exit in order to enter Eldoria itself, tried to explain the Dorian himself. You just need a reason. Well, you can find any reason. There are many reasons, but you must have a good reason. It must be deemed a good reason by the border police themselves. Or perhaps it could depend. You could have many smaller reasons. Depends on the discretion of the border guards, really, said the elder Dorian now staring at the man up and down. The young man, he thought, was ill-dressed for the whole adventure, had no bags with him, no books or paper, and he didn't seem that composed himself. People without plausible reasons are denied entry, said the Eldorian now, carefully saying the words slowly to the Dolphinian, now closing his giant book on the table between them, feeling both freed by the youth's conversation, yet also a little captivated by it also. It was a little captivating. He'd almost enjoyed having the ability to surprise the youth casually, yet also he did feel a little concern for him now, and the concern was growing a little also. A foreigner going into a world whose jargon he really didn't know yet. You do have a reason to visit, surely? Asked the older man. Seeing that he was an older Dolphinian, he guessed he probably worked for the Tarians, worked for them part-time probably, to fund his party lifestyles, no doubt, thought the Eldorian, looking at him a little severely. I want to learn about you, about your world, began the youth suddenly, after dismissing his real reason why he wanted to enter. He did have a good reason, but he was embarrassed to say it. He felt it would be too embarrassing just to admit to a strange Eldorian he just didn't know that much yet. Or did it really matter if the first Eldorian you ever met just laughed at you and thought your good reasons were ridiculous and stupid, fanciful even? You want to reduce our kingdom of Eldoria to some kind of pop song or essay or some kind of... You want to make our world into some funny film or something, is that right? For all your Dolphinians to laugh at, stated the older man seriously, a little too soberly. And the Dolphinian was shocked, hearing a little anger in the Eldorian's voice. No, I don't really sing or tell jokes or anything like that, said the Dolphinian. And then after a pause, he asked, is it funnier in your world then? Well, humour is rationed out in Eldoria. It's extremely funny for that reason, because you appreciate it when there's less of it. But no, people only laugh as much as they cry, really, so you would never want to laugh too much in Eldoria, explained the Dorian. Sounds a bit like Fantasia used to be, said the youth, not believing an Eldorian would really ever cry as much as a little fantasist would. Well, it is a little in some ways, I suppose, admitted the Eldorian, feeling that he'd been misunderstood by the Dolphinian already, at such an early point in the conversation. Like the elders in Fantasia, except we are expected to write novels about it. Not while we're crying, not during the sorrow, or even during the laughter and hysterics, but afterwards to reflect on it accurately, and to know why we laughed and why we cried, and to always find new things. We have a more faster conveyor belt than Fantasia would ever have. And deeper too, said the Eldorian, in defence of his Eldorian world, hating that it was being compared to that juvenile, awful, primitive world of Fantasia. You'll have to write novels about hysterical things and sad things, asked the Dolphinian, confused. Oh no, not all of us write novels, far from it. Some speak, some dance them, some sing them, and some splash paint to sculpt them in all manner of different ways. You have to express them somehow, though, and that's the key to it. Express the sorrow and the joy, stated the Eldorian firmly, as if he did that himself and wasn't constantly being reminded by his regulators to do that. Why do you have to do that, though? What for? Asked the Eldorian. Asked the Eldolfian. Why do you have to do that? Well, it's like our currency, it's our trade, it's our way of trading different things between each other. We trade stories for other people's stories, swapping stories with our own. It's just the way that we get by, really, he said finally. It's how we can adapt and learn to relate to each other. Suddenly began explaining the Eldorian. Why would you ever want to swap stories with other people? What's wrong with your own stories? Surely you get into some kind of muddle, said the Dolphinian. Well, that's not really the confusing part of it. Far from it. In reality, it's only fragments of our stories that we're really trading and swapping with each other. We do so to learn different lessons that each other have learned that are similar to lessons that we could learn in the future too, to help prepare us also. So we must make extra effort to have the appealing, memorable stories that seem plausible too, said the Eldorian. We're only really trading fragments of our stories. That's the confusing part of it too. They're only parts and fragmented stories at best, really, the Eldorian went on to add. Why do you have these fragments, though? Why don't you know your own story, though? Asked the Dolphinian. Well, it's too hard. It's hard to fit a century into an afternoon. And there are just so many vague chapters, missing chapters, forgotten chapters. We all have to go on mental quests to rediscover all the missing, forgotten, and the vague chapters, explained the Eldorian, though staring back out the window, avoiding eye contact, as if he really didn't want to go into it another time. What are the mental quests? Like skiing down mountains without the proper equipment or something? Asked the Dolphinian, looking out at the mountains himself. The older man summarized, looking around the room as if looking for an answer himself, searching his own limited experience of the Tarians, who lived and sometimes died for their mental quests themselves. He'd done it himself long ago. Just questioning your mind, searching your mind. It's really just scavenging through your mind, hunting in your mind, desperately searching. It's really a mind search and a mind quest, and it's retrieving many of the dormant memories that you carry but you don't know the significance of, because we have such a vast database, acquiring hundreds of thousands of memories, albeit each of them are only tiny and perhaps insignificant themselves. And even the larger, significant ones are multifaceted and complex and emotional and difficult to know, really. There are many reasons, the Eldorian said, staring out the window once more. Just questioning your mind, really, and searching other people's mind too. Mind questing together. I often mind quest alone, really, though, said the Eldorians. Some other Dorians like to mind quest alone, others go on group mind quests together. They do epic mind searches, searching each other's minds together. We have to retrieve the missing memories, to fill in the missing pages of our missing stories. It's the only way we can build up more fragments, to know more about our own world stories. Our own world is fragmented. It's not just our own life that's fragmented too, explained the Eldorian. I can't go into it all now, though. But in any case, the fragmented world, no one knows why it's fragmenting. That's part of the reason we're trying to do it, to find out why. If we could put enough of the fragmented pieces back together, perhaps we could understand what it was to begin with, and to know what it would be in the end. What we're going towards and what we've come from. The two things we just don't know. And perhaps if we all learn to mind quest with each other much more, perhaps there's hope in that. That's the hope in Eldorians, anyway. Because I mind quest alone mostly, I don't really know. I don't do group mind quests that often myself, really. Trailed off the Eldorian, feeling like he'd said far too much now, to the Dolphinian, who looked at him puzzled, almost a bit confused by it all. They're not like mind burglars or mind break-in enterers or something, asked the Dolphinian, having heard the term mind burglars at the Tarian world many times. Oh, there are mind burglars, of course, but you invite people into your mind. That's what really happens during a mind quest. Most mind quests are consensual. Everyone enters into it together, consensually. So we all agree to go on a mind quest together. Or you don't go at all. Yes, there are mind burglars, sometimes that happens, but most of the mind quests are consensual. And you wouldn't be able to get to know other people without them, really. Not in Eldoria. Of course, most people invite people into their mind world. That's how it works, really. I look through the memories with them. It's like your virtual gaming world in Dolphinia, except it's your friend's imaginary world made up of all their lifelong memories, patched together, sewn together like a patchwork quilt. It's not a stranger's world that you're inside and investigating, exploring, and wandering through. No, it's your friends, or your mother's world, your father's and partner's world, or your children's world sometimes too. You invite each other into it. You're in it, and so are many of your mutual friends. Lots of people invite multiple people, and they go into multiple friends' worlds too. What worlds there are that they've managed to collect and to put back together. Most people only have fragmented parts of their mind worlds, though, and sometimes it can be difficult exploring only the fragmentary mind worlds of people you don't know that well. You should never go into strange, fragmentary mind worlds. Be careful of that in Eldoria. Never go into an unknown, fragmentary, strange world, warned the Eldorian now a little concerned. And what he saw was quite a naive, potentially gullible, young Dolphinian that he felt much concern over. Is it like the brainstormers? Asked the Dolphinian, trying to find something similar that he knew from his earlier Tarian teachings, when Dolphinians were invited to the land of Talia itself to be taught by the Talians to live in Adultalia work life. No, it's more like brain searching rather than brainstorming. I mean, there are storming episodes that happen in it, in emergencies, in urgent searches, but most of it's moderate and calm searching. There are sometimes occasional needs for brainstorms, but on the whole, it's mostly just a brain search or brain wandering sometimes. It can be brain meandering on your casual times off as well. Can be quite fun. Sometimes it's a real serious brain search, and other times it's a casual brain search. But we like to say a mind search. You know, we are mental searchers or mind searchers. That's the more familiar term that Eldorians choose to use these days, explained the Dorian himself. Are there lots of other these mind searchers in Eldoria? Asked the Dolphinian. Oh yes, everyone is. Absolutely everyone, to some extent. Some people only occasionally enter into other people's mind worlds, and only for brief time. Only to friends' mind worlds, and even those will be fragmented. But a great many people do it a lot of the time, entering into lots of people's strange mind worlds for brief times, if they've read reports about them first, of course, and if they know other friends that have entered into those strange mind worlds. They'll do that often. Everyone does to some extent, though. It depends how much you're capable or it's necessary to do it, said the Eldorian. So we all are. We have to be, though, he explained, putting his book away now in his large briefcase, because we have so many missing or unknown chapters of all our stories. Well, said the Dolphinian, thinking it all over, wishing he had a briefcase full of multiple books also, though he didn't feel the need to carry round so many records with him. I don't know about going on a mind search. I don't know. It sounds interesting. I'd need to know more about it. I don't like the sound of the mental search, though, to be honest, or the brainstorm with other people. I'm not sure, trailed off the Dolphinian. Well, they mean the same thing. A mental search is a mind search. It's just two ways of saying the same thing. They used to be interchangeable, but mental search picked up a negative meaning, so most of us just say mind search, but it means the same thing, really, said the Dolphinian. said the Eldorian. It's funny how words change their meanings over time, though, isn't it? Asked the older man. The youth didn't understand the question so much, or the purpose of it, and so the older man returned to his own questioning, after studying the youth in his shabby clothing that was very casual, informal, and he didn't think it was suitable at all to pass through the Tarian Eldorian border. So you're on a fact-finding mission, are you? Not just looking for a good time here, because you won't find it, not in Eldoria, said the old Eldorian, finally in his brief summary. I was just curious. My friends were also. I wanted to know more about it, really. That's all. Because I heard so many stories all about you. Well, we all have done, and I wanted to know what was real and what's just made up in the stories and what was true about it. I wanted to have personal experience and meet you and meet other Eldorians and live in Eldoria and not just hear stories about you and others all the time, said the Dolphinian finally. And you want to know it as it is, not just what you want to think about it. You want to know it as it really is. It is as bad as it looks sometimes, not just this good image that you perhaps know us about, said the older man now, as if struggling though for his words after such a long talk. I don't think it looks that bad from the outside. Eldoria, I mean, we hear a lot of good things about it, that it's a happy place sometimes. A lot of people find happiness. Well, that's what we hear, said the Dolphinian. The older man shook his head, annoyed with himself though. Still reliving his years on Taria. He was reliving so many of those years on Taria, still assuming this younger youth was older than perhaps he was. Perhaps he'd misdiagnosed him as an elder phobic person. No, you don't think. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to accuse you in any way. Of course you don't think Eldoria is that bad or that good. Of course you don't think anything about us. It's me. I'm sorry. I overreact, confessed the elder man. Then there was a little awkward silence. The Dolphinian, unaccustomed to hearing such a elder confession. Then, because he and the Dolphinians were often having to fess up to the adultarians themselves, and the Tarians never confessed to Dolphinians, hardly, rarely ever at all. He was always having to confess to the Tarians, to either real or sometimes even imaginary crimes, however petty the real crimes often were. I don't know what to think, because I haven't been there, said the youth again, now feeling like maybe the elder man was accusing him, as if he was empty-headed, a blank pager, like a angry Tarian had called him on many times when he did something stupid at work. How wonderful to begin your trial without any verdict whatsoever, the Eldorian had finally said, stating quite slowly, quoting from the Book of Spiritual Laws, and seeing the youth unsure, informed him. Many of the Tarians have such ideas about us, and often such deep-rooted ideas too. Some of them simply mistake us as fellow Tarians, simply because we lived there so long. And we lived there such a long time. Once a Tarian, always a Tarian, so some of them believe at least. Only the young Tarians, the inexperienced ones, still really cling on to those beliefs anymore though. Why, even many of your fellow Dolphinians. You know there's a difference, just not what those differences always are. Only some of the Tarians visit us regularly, enough to really know. And many Dorians cannot visit Talia, not as much as they used to or would like to. Or visit Dolphinians anyway. Or only ever rarely, like myself, do I ever really, or others get to really visit Dolphinia or Talia itself. So it's hard to really know other people's worlds, other people's realities, seeing them so less often, explained the Dorian, in defense of the Eldorian world themselves. We were taught that you were part of the Tarian territories, admitted the youth himself. And we are partly. We are partly still. We are still connected to the Tarians. We have an allegiance with them. We've had the alliance a long time, and we are part Tarian, therefore. But Eldorians too. We're part Eldorian and part Tarian. So we have a dual nationality. We live in Eldoria, yes, but we also often visit and are dependent on our former ancestral land. We were all Tarians ourselves, many of us for many decades. So it was our former native land, and many of us live both in Talia and Eldoria itself, though some only live in Eldoria, have retired there full time. But even they were former residents, former natives of Talia also. So we all retain that dual nationality of living in both worlds, having a foot in both worlds still, to some varying extent, and it does vary greatly, said the Eldorian, with his eyes sloping, as if it was almost too much contemplating it all. So the Tarians didn't want to believe Eldoria is a real place, that it could be its own place on its own. They don't believe in an independent Eldoria, asked the Dolphinian, unsure, because there was so much debate about the alleged desire for independence of Eldoria. Oh, they have a lot of ideas about Eldoria. Many of them treat us like we're all back in Fantasia again, because of our dependency on the Tarians, forgetting, though, that we were Tarians for many decades, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 and 6 and 7 decades also. We were Tarians for so long, but because of now, our dependency on Talia, and that we've left Talia for so long, so many think that we are somehow regressing or going back to our Fantasia beliefs and our Fantasia lifestyles. One faction of the Tarians wants us to remain in Taria and denies any Eldorian rights at all. And another faction, they want us to go all the way back to Fantasia. And then there's a third faction that are trying to work on understanding Eldoria itself, to visit and get to know the Dorians, and not just the Tarians' idea and their fear and desires over it. For what it really is in Eldoria, there's a large growing amount of Tarians who visit Eldoria and care for Eldoria regularly. A larger group, fortunately, said the Dorian himself, feeling unable to really express the emotions, that he'd numbed himself to it all, and summarising the different Talian viewpoints of Eldoria, not wanting to go into thinking about all his experiences and his feelings that would provoke with him in a greater in-depth discussion. Glad just to give a brief summary of it, therefore. The Dolphinian was struggling to fully understand, and just as he was going to ask, how was it possible for the Eldorians to go on and to go back to Fantasia? How could they ever be expected to go back to Fantasia? The older man, feeling bad he had overloaded the tourist with all these complex dynamics that he was trapped within, and his friends and family and acquaintances were too, not wanting to burden the poor Dolphinian, yet content he had at least been honest. He'd still decided it wasn't worth delving too deeply into it anymore, deciding to change the subject, therefore. What about the Passionistas? Are they still in controlling things in Dolphinia? It all looked quite subdued on my last visit, said the Eldorian, asking now more of a question to the Dolphinian. The youngster sat opposite him, who then struggled to find an answer. The Tarians have been repressing us a long time. We have to meet in private, not in public places, for our parties now, said the Dolphinian. And the Passionistas always follow the rules, of course, joked the older man. They have been fining people for making declarations of random love, stated the Dolphinian. And larger fines, even threatening worser things, detainments, complained the Dolphinian. They're trying to stop us spreading love. You know that, said the Dolphinian, shrugging and looking away now, as if angry himself. Still trying to love the world you know not, said the Eldorian. Absolutely, got to try and love the world, got to heal the world. We've got to. It's just a hard world, a horrible world to love sometimes, complained the Eldorian. Though it was the Eldolfian that had said it. The Eldorian had thought maybe that's what he'd said many years earlier. Oh, it's love the world, is it all these days? And they're not shouting fuck the world and horrible, vulgar things like that, complained the Eldorian. I've heard all the nasty things that have been shouted by the Passionistas. One minute it's love the world, the next minute it's F the world, and all sorts of vulgar, horrible things that they chant. If they didn't try to love the world so much, maybe they wouldn't hate the world so much and be so full of hatred, spitting venom everywhere they go. I've seen their hate-filled sermons that are just as much full of love too. And if they didn't have so much passion, they shouldn't be throwing around that to random people, complained the Eldorian. I think it's blow the world now, more than F the world, said the Dolphinian. You should be angry. You should love the world so much. It's when you stop caring about the world, that's when there's problems, when people are cold to the world and don't care about anyone in the world, complained the Dolphinian now, getting a little angry at the cheek of this older man, saying it was wrong to have emotions, to try and care for other people, to try and love other people, however hard and awful that struggle could be sometimes. I admire your desire to try and love the world, but it's an impossible thing. You should start off with your friends and your family and those you know. That's a challenge enough, said the old Eldorian. Otherwise, you wouldn't have such hatred. I mean, there's a lot of hatred, isn't there? As well as this so-called love. But isn't it misplaced when you're doing it randomly? No wonder the Tarians are against random hate, because it's also part of random love too. There's still a big horrible movement though, isn't there, with the Passionistas, said the Eldorian, as if he remembered them well. Yeah, some of them are, but those are just the rebels that you hear about. They don't represent all of us, not the other Passionistas. They're just the ones you hear about that make the news. Ask yourself, why wouldn't they allow random love? Whatever could that do wrong to people? Surely random love would spread the love outside of just your friends and family and your own company and your own family and your own friendship group, but to everyone and anyone, everywhere. Spread the love to everyone, said the Dolphinian. We need random love. That random hate, that doesn't represent Dolphinians. That's just a rebel sect. They don't represent the Passionistas at all. They're nothing to do with them. They were heretics long ago and outlawed. They don't represent us. All random love, complained the Dolphinian. I don't know what goes on in Dolphinia, and I haven't been there regularly enough to know, said the older man. They do target suspected victims with flowers and all sorts, funny songs, love poems, stuff like that. People on the street that might not want anything like that, said the old Eldorian. Well, maybe victims don't want flowers. Maybe they just could be allergic to them. Maybe they're so depressed they don't want a happy song about love, or at that time in the morning, or if they're in so much pain, went on the old Eldorian, immediately defensive of his fellow Talians themselves that he'd been part of for a long time. But they can be taken out of the bad mood if they're open to it. I mean, some people are. I'm not with that sect anyway. I don't force random love anyway on people. We just do random love on people, like when we approach them and we think it seems like they want it, and then we read the signs and see if they're up for it. We judge on how they seem. You're not hoping to recruit me, I hope, said the old Eldorian. Not to the Passionistas' cause. I was only asking about it, because I was in it long ago, said the old Eldorian. No, of course not. We don't need to anyway, said the young Dolphinian. Of course not. Why not? Because I'm too old and past it. Wouldn't be able to love at my age, I guess, huh? Said the old Eldorian. No, I didn't mean it like that. You just don't look like a victim that needs random love. I wouldn't target you for random love. You just didn't look that unhappy, said the Dolphinian. Oh, okay, said the old Eldorian. I'll try and rip up my clothes, pour dinner down my top, scruff up my hair next time, he said to the Dolphinian in a rough voice. Maybe that's why none of them approach me, thought the older man out loud. Perhaps I look too well to need any random love or random care, whatever you call it, he said to Dolphinian, feeling that maybe that was the reason none of the Dolphinians travelling to Eldoria ever really had approached him in passing. I only approach victims with the others. We work in groups and then sometimes in pairs. Never alone do we do random love. Always in groups. That's what the Passionistas teach us all now. It's the new movement, said the Dolphinian. Ah, said the Eldorian. Sensible. Sounds like a much more sensible approach than in my day, stated the elder. Although I'm more intimidated talking to two hearts, much more challenging than one, said the Eldorian. Love isn't intimidating. Love is joyful. Love is free. Love is in you and love is in me, sang the youth, now quoting one of the thousands of poems that made up the Dolphinians' The Book of Love, the sacred teaching of the Dolphinians. The elder man could remember the words well. He was taught those in his Dolphinian youth as well, before becoming a heretic himself, leaving the Adalites far behind. He had been with the Adalites a long time, but finally had escaped them, joining what was later to be known as the Truth Seekers, or the Truth Questers, the Questers that he would later join. Having found too much strange love, weird love, funny love, and bizarre love, and also hurtful love, that he didn't really understand whether it was love or not. Would you want to join the Adorators ever again? We need more elders. Really, if you wanted to join, began the Dolphinian, now getting out a few leaflets that were folded up in his pocket. The older man went to speak, stopped, thought it over quick, then said it anyway. No, I find your religion sad, and also frightening and confusing sometimes too, admitted the Dorian. Why? What's sad about love? Love is the opposite of sadness, stated the youth. Sadness is the absence of love. Even a man alone in heaven would be sad himself, and no one to share it all with, rescinded the youth to the elder, repeating the words that they knew well. If it's true love, but how do you know what love is? How do I know? How does anyone know? If we try and love others without truly knowing them first, then we could be killing people, hurting them with kindness even. You can kill with kindness. Or trying to protect people that didn't really need it. Trying to love people in a way that they wouldn't understand. Knowing people is more important than loving, because if you don't know them first, you can't know how to love them, or when to love them, or why you should love them, or in what way you should love them. You know why if you get to know them first, because you can't care for something you don't first get to understand. We can all care for each other only if we get to know each other's needs first. And that isn't always obvious, concluded the elder man, giving the Dorian's teachings, trying to state it as well as he could remember it, at least, from the Book of Truths. That is why the truth is always more important than love, because without the truth, we wouldn't know how to love honestly. Otherwise, you don't know if it's an honest love or deceptive love, a caring love or a hurtful love. Well, I'm not giving up on love, however many times I'm footed. What's the point of living without it? Said the Dolphinian. It shouldn't have to be a choice, and I'm not telling you to give up on it, said the Dorian. Maybe you only need to be giving up the loves that were imaginary or exaggerated, the parts of it that were, said the Dorian. You think we're all just imagining loving others? No, not all of it. We all have imaginations, even in Eldoria, and the Tarians too. Yes, that's not to say much of it isn't true. Lots of it is. Look, I'm not here to convert you to Veritas or the Questors or anything like that. I'm trying to escape them as it is. You'll no doubt join them eventually, as you all do, when you're old enough to go on to the tellings and the hearings, said the Dorian. I'm not sacrificing love. No, not for anything. Not for a machine, not for rationality or anything like that, said the Dolphinian, complaining about what he believed Talia was all about. Quite right, and you shouldn't have to, if it's true love, yet you shouldn't have to sacrifice the truth for any kind of love either, complained the Dorian, now giving one of the sacred teachings of the Book of Loving Truth, that he could remember of it, feeling sure that perhaps he was doing injustice and misquoting it. True love is to love a stranger as yourself, quoted back the youth, quoting from the Adolphinian verses and the Book of Love. You have to know yourself to be able to love or criticize yourself, and you have to know a stranger first and become acquainted before knowing how to love or how to judge or discern what they're about, replied the elder man, just making his own defense of what he understood the strange family had told him. He often had edited the verses himself, what he could remember, ad lib about them, sometimes adding or taking parts out to fit the occasion and the audience too. Whereas the youth himself, the Dolphinian, would often just parrot the slogans, even though many of those were quite funny and quite meaningful and quite sentimental and had some value. He just quoted them, the old and the new. The elder man hadn't heard of some of them before. Despite that, the elder man thought the youth seemed a well-travelled parrot though. He'd flown well and had lots of interesting verses to quote. Funny, inspiring, and loving sometimes too. All the same, he enjoyed some of his tales of the random love movements, the latest events they'd had, and being a little outraged as well as amused at some of the random love group movements, random items from houses that were placed outside or within random places, sofas found on pavements, sometimes with the occasional resting couple sat on there, or a solitary figure resting, and his smartphone chatting away. However, often those sofas left out randomly or random chairs would just vanish altogether, not long after they were left out. Or they be sat out there ages, getting wet and boggy and getting horrible to sit on, soggy. Those were often the happy vanishings when they went missing. Quite often chairs were left to get so soggy and wet though, that they were damp and mouldy, and the materials were spoilt and rotten through. It looked like a piece of trash just left out on the pavement, at least in the heavier downpours. Books were left to go to pulp, scattered in the woods, and the scatterings were then outlawed, where ornaments would be found rusted and broken up by the weatherings throughout scatterings in the actual seasons. They were found through the meadows and the woodlands and the streets before the scatterings were lastly outlawed in the wet seasons. Yet still they were caught out by the unexpected showers. The older man agreed with the idealism of the youth. Yes, a comfortable sofa on the street, what was a long street especially, could be a nice comfortable resting place between long walks, break up the journey. But what about the weather and the street pollution and animals defecating on it and it getting trashed. And then there were the tales of the love threats being sent to strangers that had caused lots of trouble. People warned all sorts of terrible things. People were being warned on cards posted through their doors to follow their hearts or else, to follow their true love or something awful could happen. Thousands of anonymous love letters were posted to people all over the internet. Random love viruses were sent to people. People posted letters and graffiti scrawled on their houses, warning them, follow their ultimate love or the machines would control them. Older women had those kind of messages sent to them on cryptic letters shoved through the bedroom doors. Someone in the house was a suspect. There was some misunderstanding on the part of the receivers of those particular letters that warned that machines would do something and take hold of them if they didn't follow the true love, thinking that those people were the machines or represented the machine that they were threatening them with. Or that was the latest name of some gang, the Machine, that were roguing the latest streets, probably following some anarchic youth, because they certainly didn't call the supercomputer a simple machine or the machine or anything like that. No, the machine was probably some Adolfian gang roaming the local streets. The supercomputer was not a mere machine to be called something so trivial, not the Integrated System of Worldly Knowledge, ISWK, the World Integrated System of Knowledge, WISK, WISK, or the Global Library, Integrations, as some of the old-fashioned book worlds had called it. There were a great many names for the supercomputer. Other names common were still in circulation too. The knowledgeable tree, the knowing tree, the all-knowing tree, as some people had even tried to call it. Of course, it wasn't all-knowing. Of course not. It was the ever-growing knowledge of tree. The ever-growing tree was its most common known name, with all watching birds in its branches. No, but it always grew, and ever grew and out in every direction, downwards and upwards and out, up and down, internally and externally also. And not that, it always grew well. Sometimes it grew badly, sometimes it grew very well. Sometimes it grew for good, sometimes for bad. Yet whether good or bad ideas, both grew, because in Adulteria, the land of the Tarians, morality wasn't the most important thing anyway. Finding knowledge was. Knowledge that could be used for good or for bad, for any purpose whatsoever, potentially. It wasn't the job of the supercomputer to overregulate other people or how they used the knowledge. The supercomputer wasn't there to teach morality or to prescribe some moral guidance. That was for individuals to do themselves, and groups of individuals too. Each person had to decide their own morality. The supercomputer and the superprogrammers just had to produce all the knowledge that individuals would have to decide what to do with. The older man had described his own journey to see the great supercomputer, the large cubic monolith itself, the giant vast tower, the megalithic structure, with its vast four sides, representing the four elements, the four directions, the four seasons, and the four ages of man. Each of the large sizes of the supercomputer was a giant screen that projected out images from all sides, with all sorts of different graphics on display. The screen split often into multi-screens. Occasionally, for important events, gathered a giant mass of people in 4 different areas. A giant whole image was beamed out on each of the 4 sides. Films were shown on the giant screens. Films of people watching the giant screens, or wandering, meandering through the stationary crowds. Often people wandered round the giant cube, the four-faced supercomputer, the supercomputer with four faces looking out in the four directions, so they could view the news from the three different screens. And then the other one that you lived with in your own time. You could visit the other three screens and the other three faces, but only ever see one of the faces of the supercomputer at any one time. So you had to leave one showing, one program, one crowd to enter another, where quite a different atmosphere, experience, expectation might await you there. It could feel very strange, transitioning between different sides. Except, of course, there was also a fifth side that was on top and a sixth one underneath. The fifth view on top that gave people the overview. It was a large platform area on top of the monolith, a huge balcony that anyone could go up to view. Crowds massed on top of the giant cubic building so that they could have a view and see the four worlds surrounding the giant monolithic cube. Standing on top, on the fifth side that they stood on top of, so at least they could see where they were, see where they travelled to, and try to fathom where they had been, staring down below, staring out through the various telescopes, to the worlds that they travelled through before, to the different crowds and the different attractions, as well as looking ahead at different possible future routes that they could follow, different attractions in the different area that they could visit that interested them. Really, the giant monument was only symbolic, although it has on occasions been used for the various state ceremonies of the Tarian world. State Tarian ceremonies were often used there. Or different worlds of knowledge conferences that were hosted there. There were educational film trips when it wasn't open to the general public, as often it was, for artistic and social purposes. They had different exhibitions from the different worlds gathered on each of the sides of the different cubes, so that they could exhibit different shows, different artifacts, and have different people with different foods, different music, different costumes, and a whole variety of different shows on each of the monolith's different sides. The elder man had talked about his visits to the supercomputer. "Will you get examined by the supercomputer?" asked the elder man, seriously, still worried now for the Dolphinian youth. "Oh, for work I will, yes, when I have to go to work full time." "And what happens to doing it? Doing it all for love, then?" "Huh? What happened to that? Doing everything for love?" asked the Dorian now a little upset by the answer. "So you will submit to the supercomputer for work?" asked the Dorian. "People do it to survive. All Dolphinians have to. We've got to survive. No one loves the robo-doctor or the robo-cop or robo-carer," stated the youth, "but we've got to do it," said the Dolphinian. "And the supercomputer, it will choose the right job for us all, just so that we can survive, but we'll still love people outside of our work," said the Dolphinian. It wasn't wrong to love the supercomputer, because it wasn't his programmer I loved. Not a thing. It was the creator that I loved. The programmers, the designers, the artists, the creators, all of them, the masses of people that were involved in the whole creation of the supercomputer networks. The creators themselves that we loved. I loved what people did with the supercomputer and what it did for other people. It is a reflection of what people do, isn't it? Asked the older man, as if it was the youth who was supposed to know the logic. "Why do you call it the supercomputer, though?" asked the youth. "It's not super. It sends you to places that you've got to go and you don't want to go. Things Although you've got to do things that are wrong sometimes, complained the Dolphinian. Just what I was taught, that's all. I don't know. Perhaps it's not super. That's what we all called it in Taria. And I was taught to call it that for a long time. Okay, shrugged the older man. Perhaps it's not the supercomputer. I don't call it that, and none of the Dolphinians ever call it that either. It doesn't call us that. I'm not going to serve a stupid computer, even if it sends us out to jobs sometimes, said the Dolphinian. What if the stupid computer serves many good things, though? You know, is it such a stupid computer that you say you're serving? Asked the older man. It's no different than working for a person. If those people are operating a computer that sends you out to the workplaces, except it's working for lots of people that are operating it through the computer. It can show us what's compatible for our other abilities. Why, if there's a program that can guide you to the right job, partner, place, does it matter if it's a robo-teacher, a robo-auntie, or robo-tour guide? I trust the auto-translator more than some of the human translators, even though they both make mistakes. I didn't have the latest version of either, though, complained the Eldorian. There was no machine in the beginning, and there'll be none in the end, quoted the Adolphinian. The Dolphinian had quoted this finally from the Book of Love, feeling that the elder was being programmed still under the influence of the supercomputer, the fact that he still called it super. The Dolphinians didn't call it the stupid computer or the nasty computer. No, they didn't like to call it that all the time. That was just a few people that called it that. Some of them did. Isn't nature a machine, though? I mean, isn't the machine based on studying nature? Aren't our bodies kind of mechanical? Maybe wasn't the supercomputer modelled on the super brain, which we all have? Isn't the brain itself like a supercomputer beyond any computer itself, but aspiring towards it? Perhaps the stars themselves move in their own mechanistic way, like a giant computer itself. This the elder man had wondered, almost asking himself, as much as the rest of the carriage, and the Dolphinian, unsure of the answer. Well, the supercomputer thing, it isn't super nice, not to Dolphinians. No, it's not super nasty, but it's not a supercomputer, and it's not super nice, said the Dolphinian. No, it's certainly not a super lover, said the Eldorian. And it's never going to be a super person, or a good replacement for one, said the Dorian. But it's not this awful, terrible, controlling system that you have described it as, and as Dolphinians fear it as, said the Dorian. Beware the twisting, tangled tree, beware it does not confuse me, quoted the Dolphinian. Now, he quoted it from the Book of Love once more, fearing that he would hear another remind him of the old prophecy of the tree falling down, even though the trees could always keep growing for millenniums unless they were cut. They never fell. Or did they? Was entropy always breaking them down eventually anyway? Well, knowing they both had different views on it all, the elder decided not to debate the ultimate purpose for the great library, not so casually, not on a train carriage, and not to a mere new acquaintance he'd only just met. Tales from Eldoria and the growing house and the shrinking planet. When in the land of men, the world was just that, the world. The world was the world. A house was just a house. A village was only a village, and even a person was only really a person. The world of men had grew, had extended, had built up. over long periods of time. They had discovered the worlds that their ancestors, the earlier Dolphinians, never fully discovered, only knew in parts, and not how those parts were all intimately connected together. Many had thought there was a purpose. There was perhaps no end to the world's limits. They had thought there was perhaps no end to it, that you could travel and journey forever in any direction, until eventually many did travel all the way around, finding if you kept traveling in the same direction far enough and long enough, you would finally return to exactly where you were before. The world was discovered by men, and their knowledge of it began to expand. They finally had discovered the world. The knowledge of the world then grew, beginning to accumulate in knowledge, into vast databases of information, of facts, as well as also accumulating its imaginations of the facts, as well as the facts themselves. Now, where people could learn much more, they could travel much faster. Journeys that once took years or lifetimes were then reduced to many months, and then again to weeks, until one day one could arrive anywhere in a matter of days. Most places could be accessed in hours by flight. It's possible to navigate the world in only a day and a night. The world seemed to get so much smaller. Things at the beginning of the discovery Things at the beginning of the discovery were so giant. Now the whole world seemed to have shrunk and got much smaller. It seemed incredibly big once upon a time, but now the whole world had shrunk to such a smaller size. A journey that was quite frightening in some scope and distance. The world didn't shrink, but our perception of it did, because we grew up in our imaginations. With the microscope, we discovered miniature worlds within worlds. A world of bacteria naked to the eye, a world of protozoans, atoms, quarks, of cells, not to mention the discovery of insects, of tiny creatures, of smaller animals also. We were much bigger than we thought we were, like giants of the earth. Although one of the smaller giants, not like the giant elephant or like the woolly mammoth, much larger. Still, we may not be the strongest or the quickest or the most dexterous of animals. Yet we were perhaps one of the most inquisitive, curious, and became so knowledgeable about many of the other worlds, both the plant world and animal world and bacterial worlds. We had lived within and depended on too, and the fungal worlds also, that worked with us, fought with us, struggled with us, and other plants and animals that remained mysteries to be discovered later. Yet we grew so much to know many more worlds and many other species. Yet just as we discovered a potential world within the worlds, and many potential discovering of fractions of it, and perhaps discovering only a fraction of it, or an unknown amount. Through also the telescopic discovery, mankind also discovered many more stars in the universe also, and that there could be worlds outside our own world. So we discovered worlds outside our own world, as well as the worlds within our world. The star systems that we only knew so remotely, so distantly before. A universe that has shrunken the giant planet into a tiny seed, or our own sun that's been shrunk into a small star. Just as one pebble on a beach or an island in an ocean of billions of stars, with vast unimaginable spaces between us and other living planets, or possible living planets too. At first, The womb is the world, is the home. Then the nursery room is the world home. Mother Earth is the primary carer in the room, until a governess and the house, and the family becomes the world, or the world was a family house, when family meant the world to people, and people lived in familiar worlds. Many families in union, or working together, became a village, a smaller tribe, a clan, a group of many families, living, working, struggling together. Although these were often stranger families too. To begin with, until they became friends of the family, acquaintances of family. So the village was the world eventually. For a long time, there were many different families and tribes and all sorts of groups. It was a tribal world and a stranger world, trying to keep connected to all of it, connected to the old family world, the friendly world that we had much left behind us. We left much of the family world and the friendship world behind, seeking out the new alien world, the unknown world, the exotic world of exotic people, places, animals, lands, music, food, chemicals, books, stories, an age of experiments, of travels, of discovery, of mystery worlds, the unfamiliar worlds being discovered, groups of tribes becoming nations or countries and empires, so that nations were seen as the whole world to some people, and then the empires were too. Many nations made the world. It was a world of many empires over many millenniums. There were feuding worlds, social worlds, liberal worlds, asocial worlds, antisocial worlds, austere worlds, monarchical worlds, democratic worlds, meritocratic worlds, plutocratic worlds, aristocratic worlds, anarchic worlds, humanistic worlds, animistic worlds, rational worlds, irrational worlds, emotional worlds, ideological worlds, thoughtful worlds, rude worlds, polite worlds. There were lovers of worlds, haters of worlds, prisoners of worlds, free people of worlds. The world seemed to become everything, everywhere, all at once. There was a world of victims, a world of courts, a world of all sorts, a world of judges, a world of corruption, a world of sickness, a world of madness. There was an evil world, an ugly world, a virtuous world, a hot world, a cold world, an indifferent world too, just as it was equally judged to be also a world of gratitude, a caring world, an able world, a healing world, a world of sanity, a beautiful world, a good world. It was all these different things, that there was so much more of everything that one could know about. We just knew more of all of it, the good, the bad, the beautiful, and the ugly. Not that there were more of all of these things, but that we all knew more about all of the different things, all the different worlds within the worlds. The world is the world, yet who can say when the world is, how the world is, when the world really is, who it really is, or why it even is? No one can fully answer the most fundamental of those questions, to fully know and know everything. Yet we all try in our own ways to try and discover, how did we all get here? And where in the universe are we? When did we arrive here? How did we? And more importantly, where are we all heading in the universe? How will we depart? And when? The more the knowledge of life progressed, the more mysteries were discovered too. So the more we knew, the more also we knew we didn't know. So, simultaneously, a knowledgeable world becomes a more mysterious world. The tree of knowledge grows and the tree of mysteries grows too. Because it was a working world, and sometimes a childish world, a struggling world, a studying world, a travelling world, a consuming world, a cooking world, cleaning world, arguing world, debating world, conversational world, a funny old world, a party world, a sociable world, a caring world, a sick world, a lawful world, a criminal world, a policing world, an entertaining world, a sad world, a theatrical world, a true world, a scientific world. There were so many different worlds: filmed worlds, written worlds, playful worlds, novel worlds, virtual worlds, gaming worlds, technological worlds. It seemed as if we were ever discovering more worlds within the worlds, more ways to relate to the world, yet we remained in the very same world, with mysteries hidden within it, and with worlds of mysteries beyond. So the tree of mysteries grows like the tree of knowledge, much more so, further back in history. The further back in history, future, or space you go, the less you know too. So how important is our knowledge as people, as humanity, if we don't know the context of our origins, our destiny, our place in the universe? Are we a world of knowledgeable people, or just an island of unknowing people, aliens to the universe? Not that we are totally unknowing. Our probes, our instruments see many worlds, yet not to know intimately. Some people feel exiled from the universe, or watched over by the stars. Others really don't know, feel mystified by the universe and the stars, but at least know that we don't know. Dying and death are preoccupations of many Eldorians. Social deaths, like ideological deaths or emotional death, just like a physical death, can be sudden, or it can be slow, gradual. It can be a sudden, swift, and shocking event, though. Yet often it was a slow, gradual thing, with many different stages of it, many slow graduational processes of the dying age. Often ideological death followed social death. People trapped in the echo halls of their own ideas, sometimes living with just a few shelves of books, or just a handful of books sometimes, or even just a few sentences, in a world of libraries. Others only with a handful, just a few paragraphs, sometimes left with just a sentence, or even just part of a word. People could live and die for many months, years, decades without any social contact with their current world, only reflections from many former worlds on the past world. Certainly, there were lots of histories to dwell upon. Those who had totally or mostly died socially had only history or herstory or their stories, and whose ideas were born in various times in the past. The ideas are historical, past ideas for past people, but not present ideas or familiar ideas, not sociable ideas to the world. Even though people lost contact with the current world, they were so busy for so long studying all the past worlds, because there were so many of those, because they were cut off from their present world. Remembering the world, not interacting with it, becomes a preoccupation. That is, trying to recall the relevant past worlds, the past events that give meaning and a context for the present world, even though one is less connected to that present world. People who struggle ideologically, yet are more social, lack sometimes the historical context. Yet those who are more ideological and struggle more socially will lack sometimes the present context. Either way, lacking historical or geographic awareness, a lack of abilities can be an emotional complex. It can be a challenge, for it is sad and fearful and bewildering to be separated from your past, or to be separated from your surrounding environment. It also can be a funny experience also too, and a chance to learn other things too. Children learn to feel before they learn to talk and think rationally. They tell stories and sing long before they start rationalizing with their logical arguments and their theories. With people that lack communication with others, they can regress, revert back to childhood tendencies, giving up rational worldviews before giving up many ideas. One prefers stories and songs to the assumptions that one can know the world so factually and logically. One rejects objective analysis for more emotional, subjective feelings, emotional stories, emotional songs, and a love and a fear of sensations also. If one has an emotional death, however, rather than a social or ideological one, then there is no desire nor fear of others. There is no love of others either, nor sadness for others, nor anger nor joy. Like with ideas and social position, our emotions can also decline gradually over time, becoming increasingly numb to things. Or there can be a sudden, shocking stopping of them. Emotional death, when one's feelings can be extinguished, stop suddenly, like water poured onto a fire, passions of love and hate that can be simmered and that can be extinguished in a single act where trust can be broken, or a grudge can be forgiven, or a debt repaid.